What's going on, guys? Dr. Mike here again, and today we are getting into Learning Outcome 3 from Unit 4. So what we're going to be talking about here is some different definitions you're going to see with some of the cardiac or cardiovascular terms that we would look at normally, and then we're going to look at how both strength and resistance training affects our overall cardiovascular system. So let's get right to it. So the first couple terms we're going to look at here are EDV and ESV. EDV is your end diastolic volume, ESV is your end systolic volume. When you think of diastole or systole, what you should be thinking about is the pressure that is being enacted inside the heart. So end diastolic volume isn't the amount of pressure inside the heart, and by the heart I mean that we're going to be talking about or referring to the left ventricle as for most of these. So when you measure your EDV, you're measuring the amount of volume of blood that is left in the heart at the end of diastole. So what diastole will do is this is when the heart relaxes. So your end diastolic volume is how much blood gets filled into the left ventricle as it relaxed. When you look to the end systolic volume, this here is the amount of blood left over when the heart contracts. So if I am contracting or squeezing the heart like I am here with this water bottle, the amount of blood that gets left in the bottle after I squeeze is my end systolic volume. Now these next few terms, we got three more and then we're going to talk about blood pressure here. QSV and HR. Q stands for cardiac output. I know it shouldn't it be a CO, but anyway. HR is heart rate, pretty self-explanatory there. And then SV is stroke volume. Your cardiac output is measured as the product of your stroke volume times your heart rate. All our cardiac output is how much total blood our left ventricle pumps each minute. So to find that, you would need to calculate your stroke volume, and your stroke volume is the amount of blood that your left ventricle pumps out with each beat, and multiply that by your heart rate, or the amount of times your heart beats per minute. That gets you your cardiac output. You can measure stroke volume by measuring your end diastolic volume from your end systolic volume. That'll tell you how much blood was actually pumped out of the left ventricle. Now, when your stroke volume is not enough to meet the needs of your body, this is when you're considered to be in heart failure. Heart failure just means that your heart cannot work hard enough to supply or meet the needs of your body. Now, an interesting note here is that virtually everyone that does not have heart disease, so if you're an apparently healthy adult, your cardiac output at rest is going to be 5 liters per minute, roundabout there. So that means for every minute you're sitting at rest, your blood is circulating at a rate of 5 liters per minute. That's almost your entire supply of blood. So virtually every minute your entire amount or entire blood volume in your body cycles through yourself once. This doesn't change if you are well trained or if you're a couch potato. It's still going to be about 5 liters per minute. Now keep that in mind because we're going to revisit this here in a few slides. Ejection fraction is a measure of how efficient our heart is. When you are measuring your ejection fraction, this is a percentage of how much blood gets ejected from the left ventricle. If you look here, we're going to focus on this area and we're going to focus on this area here. The way you calculate an ejection fraction is you take your stroke volume and you divide it by your end diastolic volume, and that gives you a percentage. Ideally, you would like 100% of the blood that fills your left ventricle during your end diastolic volume to be ejected or to be sent into the body, but that doesn't happen. Our hearts are really only about 50 to 65% effective. So what you're seeing here, and in this first one here, this is an echocardiogram, which is just an ultrasound image or a 2D image of your heart beating. Down here you're seeing an MRI. So this is an MRI. And what I want you to notice is just how much these are going to be contracting. If you look at the top picture, you can see here how the heart contracts to roughly here, and then it expands out. This, now granted, you're not going to be able to tell the ejection fraction just from this, but the ejection fraction for this is given at about 58%. Down here, it's given at 23%. So when I look at these again, you'll see how much the top picture contracts. So there's a major movement there. At the bottom, you notice how this, being your left ventricle here, it barely moves. There's virtually nothing moving there. That is what would be considered heart failure. When you have your ejection fraction under 40%, you are considered to be in heart failure. Now, for the United States only, you can't claim disability from heart failure until you reach an ejection fraction of under 30%. So, kind of unfair that your heart can be failing, but yet it may not be considered failed enough to mean that you're considered disabled. But overall, ejection fraction just measures how efficient our heart is and how well our left ventricle can pump blood. Now, before I get into exercise, I wanted to get into the blood pressure because this is really kind of an important thing here. When we talk about blood pressure, you are talking about just simply the amount of pressure inside the heart itself. You can indirectly measure this if you have a blood pressure cuff by like getting a blood pressure on your arm. You could sometimes do it in your forearm, wrist, or even say like your ankle can get it measured. What you're measuring with blood pressure is how hard your heart works when it has to contract or pump blood, and then how much it can relax when it lets its chambers fill with blood. So what we call this here, or what we term this, is our preload and afterload. Your preload is essentially the same as your end diastolic volume. So when you preload, it means your heart is relaxing. You are allowing blood to fill your chambers. Your preload is also considered your diastolic blood pressure, or the bottom number. So if your blood pressure normally is 120 over 80, preload is this 80. This is how much pressure is left in the heart while it is relaxed. In terms of, say, like overall health, this is the more important number because this one tells us how well our heart can actually relax. The higher your bottom number, or your diastolic number is, the worse off you are because it essentially says your heart is under constant high pressure. Now, when we get into the next slide here, into afterload, afterload is measuring how much pressure it takes for the heart, and specifically the ventricles, to contract to get blood to go outside of the body. Now, you would typically measure this independently for both your right ventricle and your left ventricle. For our purposes here, we're more concerned about the left ventricle because this pumps out our blood to the rest of our body. Now, when this happens, you see with these arrows here how it's indicating the cardiac muscle, which is all this, so all this on the edges here, that's all your cardiac muscle, and that'll contract inward. When that contracts inward, obviously blood's going to shoot out through the aorta, which is here. Your afterload or systolic pressure, this is the top number on your blood pressure, is how much pressure is right here. What you have there is you have a valve, and that is your left semilunar valve. And you just want to know how much pressure it takes for the left ventricle to break that seal. If the left ventricle did not have enough pressure to exceed the pressure in the aorta here, you wouldn't be able to pump blood out of your heart at all, and then your heart stops. So the pressure for the left ventricle here exceeds that of the pressure from the aorta, and it allows blood to go into the aorta and out to the body. Now, if you have a chronically high blood pressure, so if you have your blood pressure elevated, and a high blood pressure or hypertension would be considered anything above 130/90. And I didn't mention what these numbers actually mean, but they're measured in terms of mmHg, which means millimeters of mercury. Mercury is a compressible liquid, and when blood pressure monitoring was first adapted or first really created, mercury was used as the pressure gauge because it was the most reliable indicator, and it's still used today. Although now in most common blood pressure sphygmomanometers, you'll see they have actually an alcohol-based substance in there. But mmHg is millimeters of mercury, which is what the actual pressure is measuring. Now, if that's too high, this is what happens. You get what's called hypertrophy of the heart. When you think of hypertrophy, as we discussed in Unit 2, that is when your muscles get bigger. It's really good when that happens for skeletal muscle. It's really, really bad when that happens for cardiac muscle. When it happens to the heart enlarges. So you don't want that to happen, because the more that this heart muscle is enlarged, the less overall room we have here in the chamber itself. If you look in the first picture, you see you got tons of room here. And that's all because the walls of the ventricles here are normal. The problem with the heart is that it doesn't have anywhere to go. The inside chambers don't get bigger as the outside gets bigger. So when that cardiac muscle gets bigger, it's just compressing that ventricle together. This is like if you fill up your closet. Your closet is a finite space. It cannot get bigger unless you knock a wall out, and that can technically happen with the heart. You can actually get a hole in this section here, which is the heart septum. So like if you have a septum in your nose, this is a septum you have in your heart, just that separates the left and right side. You can get a hole in there, but if you do that, you're very likely to have like a heart attack or stroke, so not a good thing. But yeah, if you're filling up your closet full of stuff, eventually you have no more room for it, so you can't store anything else in there. Same thing happens with the ventricles. If the walls of your heart get thicker, they close in on the space available. that means that you are going to reduce your stroke volume. You cannot have a high stroke volume if you have an enlarged heart. It's because the heart muscle is big, but the chamber, the space that needs to hold blood, is very small. Now, finishing up here with our adaptations to exercise, because this is kind of really where the important stuff lies for us. Whenever you exercise, whether it be strength-based work or endurance-based work, it's going to be beneficial for you. You may use the term cardio exercise, and what that just really indicates is that it's your cardiovascular exercise. So it's the exercise specifically designed to improve or help out your cardiovascular system, mainly your heart. So if you look on the endurance training side, that's primarily going to be your cardio. So if you look at every single measure here, everything pretty much gets increased except for cardiac output. And I'm going to come back to that in just a second, like I said I would earlier. Decreases to our blood pressure, increases to our plasma volume, increases to our red blood cell count, increases to your stroke volume. Now, stroke volume, remember, is a part of cardiac output, so kind of keep that in mind. When you do strength training, you notice that it does improve a little bit on your left ventricular wall thickness. Now, getting your left ventricular wall thicker can be helpful as a response or as an adaptation to exercise. It is not helpful when it's an adaptation to high blood pressure. So don't let that confuse you. And then the only other thing really that strength training is going to help you with is decreasing your overall blood pressure, which again overall helps your heart. So for exercise recommendations, clearly endurance or cardio training is the way to go, and this is why you should stress the importance of having a training program where it doesn't just strictly emphasize one aspect of training over the other. You need to do cardio training for heart health. You need to do strength training for overall health. You need to do both of them together to get the best of both worlds. Now, coming back to cardiac output and exercise. Remember, cardiac output equals stroke volume times heart rate. But we look here, and the adaptation to exercise for both strength and endurance is little change. Well, how can that be? Especially because we see that stroke volume, especially as a result of endurance training, increases. Now, like I said before, at rest, your cardiac output is about 5 liters per minute, or 5 liters of blood per minute. That's for everyone, unless you had heart disease or a compromised cardiovascular system. When you exercise, you maintain this 5 liter per minute cardiac output at rest. But you're going to change the component parts. So for cardiac output to stay at 5 liters per minute, what has to happen is stroke volume is going to increase while heart rate is going to decrease. This means here that when you are well trained, especially well trained in endurance training, at rest, your heart is extremely efficient. The lower your heart rate at rest, the better. The higher your stroke volume at rest, the better. The higher your stroke volume anytime, the better. So I said, though, that at rest, everyone's cardiac output's 5 liters a minute. what does that mean for untrained people? So if you're untrained, you're still equaling 5 liters a minute. But this is because your stroke volume is lower and your heart rate is higher. Average resting heart rate for a normal, apparently healthy adult is around about 75 beats per minute. In an endurance trained athlete, you can get that down to around 50 beats per minute. At the end of the day, your heart is just a pump. That's all it is. It does no more, no less. It just pumps blood and that's it. It doesn't matter if you get your heart or your pump from the pump store and you buy it with a pump store warranty. You only have so many pumps in that apparatus. The less amount of pumps you have to use, so the lower your resting heart rate, because you rest for the majority of the time you're alive. Think about all the time you're sleeping, when you're just sitting, kind of doing nothing. The majority of the time you are alive, you are at rest. The lower you can get your heart rate while you're at rest, the longer it's going to last. Now, this doesn't say that exercise is going to be your silver bullet or your magic bullet for, say, preventing a heart attack or other cardiovascular disease, but it's going to go a long way for it. So that is your overview here of our different nomenclatures and readings associated with the cardiovascular system and how our heart gets adapted to exercise. And then from here on out, we'll be getting into more of the training types moving forward and heading into the respiratory system for our next unit. But until then, I will catch you all later.